to see her here in the congregation. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay? Okay, well, we've got a little bit of a makeshift setup here for slides, so hopefully people can see this well enough. If not, I'll try to continue to talk to you through all of this, and certainly afterwards, I'm happy to make these available. They can be, disseminated hopefully by email for those who might be interested. So I'm going to try to toggle back and forth here between the computer and the screen. But yeah, given that we're a relatively small group, I want to make this certainly conversational as well. I'll have some formal material to present, and certainly we'll pause at various points for any kind of questions or comments that people might have. I'm glad one of the silver linings of the crushing bowl defeat of Michigan last week was that there was no conflict tonight. Otherwise, I was going to have to do a 20-minute talk. But we don't have that issue tonight, so plenty of time. So I'm going to talk about, as the talk title signifies, dementia and brain health. And so let's just start with what I call kind of dementia 101, because people often wonder, well, what's the difference? They hear dementia, Alzheimer's, are those the same things? What are the distinctions? So I thought I could start with a definition up front. So when we say dementia, we really use it as kind of a broad umbrella term to describe what we call progressive decline in memory and thinking skills over time. And but that's a pretty general description, and dementia really can occur due to many different causes. Just because you say dementia, it's not saying anything about what the underlying cause is. So Alzheimer's, as you can see from this graph, happens to be the most common type of dementia, but it's certainly not the only type. And some other common types listed here are vascular, Lewy body, frontotemporal. You can even have dementia in the context of things like Parkinson's disease, HIV. So really, dementia is that broad term, and a lot of times in medicine, we're trying to figure out what's the underlying cause, because that underlying cause may dictate what do we want to do in terms of the treatment for the condition. So does that definition make sense? And again, it's usually kind of a slow, steady decline over many years for any kind of dementia, but particularly we see this with Alzheimer's disease. And to make matters even more complicated, sometimes you can have dementia that has what we call mixed dementia, so it actually has multiple causes. So you can have Alzheimer's pathology in the brain co-occurring with vascular pathology, and that they can both together create the symptoms that you might see in a loved one of progressive issues with cognition over time. So this graph here, I think, kind of shows what can happen. Again, it's usually not in as straight a linear progression as on this graph, but I think the idea is, in research and practice, we're seeing people, maybe kind of earlier on, they might start to decline in this phase that we call MCI, or mild cognitive impairment, which refers to this stage where someone does have some impairment. Their memory and thinking isn't as sharp as it once was, but it's not causing any kind of functional problems. People are still able to carry out their everyday activities. But then ultimately people do progress to dementia, and usually the stages are mild, moderate, and severe. So this is kind of just a general graph of how someone's cognitive functioning may progress over time. But what's really an exciting time for dementia and Alzheimer's research is that we are now able, much better than we ever used to be, to identify people in what we call this preclinical phase. This idea where people might be totally intact in terms of their memory and thinking, but we're able now to do tests to see, do people have some of these early signs in the brain such that we might be able to initiate treatment earlier, or at least give people recommendations earlier about things they might do. So this is kind of a broad schematic that I'll refer to over the course of the night, but I just wanted to kind of introduce it at the outset. And so what's interesting is it used to be that we didn't really have a great sense for how long were things starting to develop in the brain before any actual symptoms occur. And so the estimates are now that maybe even like 15 to 20 years before people have any memory or thinking problems, things are starting to change in their brain, and we might be able to detect using a variety of tests. So let me stop there, see if there's any questions or comments about this issue of kind of a preclinical phase into mild cognitive impairment, then into dementia.
Just a question.
Yes.
So, when you start this, I mean, are we all gonna be somewhere along that continuum?
No, this just kind of refers to people who do develop dementia. But it's a good question. That it used to be, people thought, well, is dementia just part of normal aging? And we know that that's certainly not the case. It is considered a disorder. And a lot of people, so you may know some of them, live into their 90s, 100s without ever developing dementia. They might not be quite as sharp as they used to be. Again, maybe their memory isn't quite as good, or maybe their thinking isn't quite as quick. In fact, that is part of normal aging, where maybe our reaction time is not as great, or we have that kind of tip of the tongue phenomenon, or we're trying to remember the name of someone. But when we get to the point where people's memory and thinking declines to the point where they're really not able to do meaningful activities that they used to do, that's when we start to think of it as dementia. If that makes sense. All right, so how is a dementia diagnosis made is something that I'm often asked, and so I'll kind of walk you through some of the ways in which this might happen. And ideally, this diagnosis is usually better made by someone with kind of experience in the field. I think there's been a challenge in that a lot of primary care physicians, they might be able to screen for memory and thinking problems, but they're not necessarily trained to make an advanced diagnosis like this. So ideally, we're talking about a neurologist or maybe a geriatrician, but no matter who the physician is, the idea is to get a pretty thorough medical history from both the patient and what we call a reliable informant, a loved one who knows them well, kind of knows their everyday activities. This can be challenging, of course, because if someone has maybe a more advanced dementia, their self-report may not be super reliable. So sometimes getting this history can be challenging. Sometimes people, they live alone, and so they don't have a highly reliable informant. But if we, in many cases though, we do have someone, maybe it's a spouse, an adult child, who's able to kind of be that informant. And so usually the physician's trying to get information from both the patient and their care partner, and getting that kind of history. Then there's a physical and neurological exam is usually involved. Lab tests are usually done, so a lot of times these blood tests, for example, might rule out what we call competing potential causes of the memory and thinking problems, because sometimes something might look like a dementia, but it's actually maybe a severe depression, or maybe people have a vitamin B12 deficiency or anemia. There's a lot of other reversible causes of memory and thinking problems that we want to rule out. And so sometimes those lab tests can help rule out those other causes of the symptoms. We often do memory testing. Some of you may have had this happen where you're asked to make a list of a few words, you're asked to then recite them a few minutes later, or maybe draw a clock. So some of these kind of pencil and paper tests can be useful, particularly if we have them over kind of a series of different times in life. We can kind of see, is there any decline, or is somebody pretty stable in this memory testing. At more advanced centers, we can do neuroimaging, so we can do MRIs, PET scans. And as I'll talk about, some of this neuroimaging is where we can detect these changes in the brain that are classic signs of Alzheimer's or other types of dementia. So that's a relatively new development, is to have this kind of imaging to be able to detect some of what we call biomarkers. And so they're not always available everywhere, because they do, they're often at specialty centers, like at U of M, but they can be very useful. And so those biomarker tests I mentioned, the two classic biomarkers in Alzheimer's disease are known as amyloid plaques and tau tangles. So those are the two cardinal features of Alzheimer's brain pathology. And so those can be picked up by PET scans or MRIs typically. Although now, as I'll talk about, we're starting to see what we call blood-based biomarker tests to even detect this, which would be a huge advance to be able to do something via a simple blood test as opposed to a super expensive, complicated PET scan. But as I mentioned, there are a lot of challenges in terms of access to experts who can do all of this and do all of this well. But I think that this is kind of the gold standard in terms of a workup to diagnose Alzheimer's or related dementia. So I'll stop there. Any questions or comments on this idea of how a dementia diagnosis is made? Yes, Nancy?
Before you go, let me give you this.
Turn my light up a little bit.
Okay, we're trying to make it so that the people live stream will be able to see the slides.
Just a little bit more, yeah. I was just wondering, Scott, whether at this point it's likely that you could get insurance coverage for an MRI or a CT scan to look for.
I think it can depend on the plan you have, and it can depend on the site and the indication, like is it medically indicated. So I think there's some variability there in terms of insurance coverage. So sometimes I think it will be covered. I think that would be probably, it's kind of a case-by-case situation. But we'll talk about this issue of insurance coverage with some of the new therapies. We'll talk about new drugs that are being approved, where that has been a challenge, where Medicare hasn't always reimbursed for some of the treatments that are being developed.
Because I guess I'm wondering if you showed the progression, and if the goal is to find it earlier rather than later, it would seem that getting the test done before somebody was exhibiting lots of symptoms would be ideal. But on the other hand, I could imagine that it would be very, it wouldn't be possible to just do it on a routine basis, so.
Yes, well, maybe one case example will help kind of illustrate your point. So there is something called amyloid neuroimaging, which is done by a PET scan, which can detect amyloid plaques in the brain. And so a lot of people who aren't symptomatic, but who maybe have a family history, are very interested. We've actually done research studies where we offer those people the chance to learn that. But that indication for an asymptomatic person will never be covered right now by insurance. The idea is that kind of test would only be covered for a differential diagnosis, again, maybe to rule in or out Alzheimer's in someone who's already having symptoms, if that makes sense.
Scott, I noticed you didn't put any numbers on that graph where you showed the gradual decline.
Yeah.
Is there any reporting of the prevalence of dementia in the general population?
Yeah, I'll be getting to some of those numbers in just a little bit, so hold tight. All right, so hopefully this kind of gives you a picture of the important components of a dementia diagnosis. So maybe if you're dealing with a loved one who you think might need to be seen, maybe thinking about what might be possible in terms of workup, because I think it really is great to be able to get an accurate diagnosis up front, because everything does flow from that in terms of a treatment plan. So that's a little bit on dementia writ large. Let's go more detail in terms of Alzheimer's disease, since that's the most common type of dementia and what often people talk about when they think about this condition. So I want to put a plug in for the National Alzheimer's Association. They're a great organization. Some of you may know about them. And what they do, among many things, is they put out an annual report of facts and figures. So some of the statistics I'm going to be talking to you tonight about come from this annual report. So I've got the URL link there. But one thing they do is they look at prevalence in the general population of Alzheimer's disease. And as you probably have heard, given that we have a population that's moving into older age, the baby boomer generation getting into their 70s and 80s, we're going to see an increase over time. So what this graph shows is overall Alzheimer's cases, and then it breaks it down by age group. And you can see this purple is the 85 and older group. And so because that segment of the population is growing so dramatically, you can see how that group is going to account for a greater proportion of Alzheimer's cases overall. So right now it's estimated we have a little over 6 million people with Alzheimer's in the United States, but if we don't have dramatic improvements in terms of kind of treatment and risk reduction, that number may more than double within the next several decades. So I think this is kind of the argument used to say, well, this is why we should be investing as a society on many levels into addressing this problem because of these. Not only is it a hugely common problem now, but we're going to see it become even more common. So a hand up, yeah.
There used to be sort of more of a clinical thought about if you got to a certain age without having a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, you were pretty well over the hump. This doesn't look like it.
No, that's not the case. Age is the most important risk factor for Alzheimer's, and it does seem to continue, risk continues to rise with age. But that being said, it's not a certain thing. If you live, we at Boston University where I was, we had a centenarian study, and the enrollees in that study were picked because they had a remarkable health even into their hundreds. So obviously there's people out there who defy the odds.
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
And the question is there a link between hardening of the arteries and dementia?
Yes, so hardening of the arteries is kind of, I would say, maybe an outdated term. It used to be used more commonly, and so it's not really seen as any kind of formal medical diagnosis these days. And so, but that language used to be used sometimes, but I don't think it's used as much anymore. But I'll certainly talk about the link between risk factors for conditions like heart disease or other conditions that also seem to be risk factors for Alzheimer's and related dementia. Another kind of thing that was talked about maybe a few decades ago that maybe is not seen as important anymore is this idea of aluminum as a risk factor. I don't know, I forget exactly where that idea came from, but several decades ago, a lot of people were worried about pots and pans they cook with, but that's not seen as a concern these days. So I mentioned biomarkers. So this is kind of a pictorial of some of these amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So neurofibrillary tangles are made of a protein called tau. So this is something that, as I mentioned, are the cardinal features of Alzheimer's. It used to be we could not see these in the brain until we did an autopsy at death. But the advantage of some of these new imaging technologies, and now I mentioned blood tests even coming on board, are that we can detect these well before any symptoms occur. And so a lot of the new treatments that are being tested that I'll talk about are trying to attack these plaques and tangles earlier and earlier on in the disease process.
Is amyloid part of the process of how is it involved in the memory process itself? Normal levels of amyloid.
I think it only becomes a real problem for memory and thinking is when it kind of gets deposited in these clumps that interfere with neurotransmission. So it's not necessarily a problem that amyloid is being produced, but when it develops in these kind of plaques, these clusters in the brain in kind of significant amounts and across different parts of the brain, that's when we start to see. And there's this whole theory called the amyloid cascade theory where the thought is that maybe kicks off. Usually amyloid plaques start to develop before the tau tangles, but usually the amyloid plaques are maybe the initial sign, and then we start to see over time things like the tau tangles then develop. We start to see inflammation in the brain. We start to see atrophy, shrinking of the brain. So there's this whole series of events that it's thought that amyloid plaques start to kick that off. And so the theory has been, maybe that's a good first place to start with these treatments. But as I'll talk about, they have not been kind of magic bullets, the treatments that have been anti-amyloid therapies. So in fact, over the past couple decades, we went almost 20 years between the FDA's last approved medication for Alzheimer's and then Aduhelm, was it, I guess, a year and a half ago, summer of 2021. Aduhelm was approved by the FDA for treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And so it's one of many of these anti-amyloid therapies where the idea is that the drug clears the amyloid plaques from the brain. And so the hope was once we have that amyloid clearance, then we start to see better outcomes in terms of Alzheimer's disease. That hasn't always been the case. We've had certainly some medications that have been successful in clearing the amyloid from the brain, but people have still continued to progress. So Aduhelm, it was a kind of, people followed this debate at all. It was approved by the FDA, but its evidence was really mixed. It had kind of two major clinical trials. One seemed to suggest it did have some benefit. One actually said it didn't seem to be that much different than placebo. But I think we were so starved for a new Alzheimer's treatment, we saw the FDA, the controversial decision, approve that medication. But Medicare said, we're actually not going to pay for it. We paid the millions of people who might take this, it would bankrupt our system. We don't think the drug is efficacious enough to warrant paying for it. So even though it was approved by FDA, the drug maker Biogen basically abandoned it because people weren't using it because it wasn't being reimbursed. A lot of clinicians weren't convinced it was worth some of the side effects that might occur. So even though it was approved, it really wasn't used widely. Fast forward to last Friday. So I called the FDA. I'm wondering if you guys please approve the drug. Sure. So lecanemab, now it's the trade name is Leqembi, was approved on Friday. So it's also in the same class as Aduhelm. So it's one of these anti-amyloid therapies approved for the treatment of Alzheimer's, except it had more convincing efficacy data than Aduhelm. But it's important to point out it's still not going to reverse cognitive symptoms. It's really just making the decline slower. So you saw that graph was kind of, it's just that line is going to be going at a less steep slope, but people will still ultimately decline over time on Leqembi, but they might have kind of several more months of kind of better functioning, just that decline is slow. So it's designed for people, remember I mentioned MCI, mild cognitive impairment? So it's designed for people with either mild cognitive impairment or mild Alzheimer's. So it's actually, it wasn't really tested and proven on people with more moderate to severe causes of the disease. And it's administered by IV every 2 weeks, so that's also a complication. And it does have some notable side effects. So there is a risk of increased swelling or bleeding in the brain because of this drug, particularly among certain groups of patients. So one group of patients that's at elevated risk for these side effects are what we call ApoE4 carriers. There's a certain gene called ApoE where if you have a certain variant, you're seen as being at higher risk for this side effect. And also patients who are on blood thinners seem to be at elevated risk. So you can tell, on one hand, it's great news. We've been really wanting a new treatment for Alzheimer's, so it's an exciting development. On the other hand, it's not going to be a cure, it's not going to reverse the disease, and there's these other factors such as your side effects. It's supposedly right now it costs about $26,000. We'll see if Medicare covers it. It's still early on. Medicare may decide to cover it, but right now that's still an open question. So those are some of the pros and cons, but I think I saw hands up. I'll pause here for any questions on these new treatments.
Before questions, could I ask you to, for the people online that are having trouble hearing the question, could you repeat the question as you
Sure. Yes.
So I guess my question is, given that these treatments so far just slow the deterioration, and given that with normal aging we lose some cognitive ability anyway, and this is all, just a slide that we're on
these trajectories of decline, and when might they become noticeable enough, I think, to the patient and family members where they would seek help and get a diagnosis. I think that can really vary from one person to the next, and practitioners themselves can vary. Some practitioners might say, oh, that's just part of normal aging, and they might downplay symptoms that a patient or family is bringing up. So I think there's not kind of a one-size-fits-all to that question. I think, but in terms of MCI, mild cognitive impairment, by definition, that person's impairment has not developed to the point where their everyday activities are affected. So a lot of times people don't come in at the MCI phase because they can still drive fine, they can still manage their finances okay, they're just not as sharp. So some of it might depend on how worried are they about this. Do they have a family history? Or something, but it may depend on the person. I remember there's a legendary neurologist at WashU. One of his patients was this CPA, and for him, the thing that brought him in was he couldn't do his taxes, where that's what he did for a living. Whereas, maybe some of us can't do our taxes, that's because we form another. So it might depend on what your tasks that you are kind of used to doing, and you start to see, wow, I'm really not what I used to be, and that's concerning to me. So it can really depend on what gets people to come for help. And people have a lot of different attitudes too on what's the utility of an early diagnosis. Some people, they're like, I want everything done possible. I think it's valuable to know this information, whereas others are like, there's not great therapies out there, so why? They're concerned maybe about the stigma of a label, so they might delay. So it's pretty complicated stuff. I hope this makes sense what I'm talking about. Yes, sir.
One aspect of the side effects. Were there some significant ones with the first drug, and what are the side effects or risks of these two?
Yeah, so the side effects are kind of classified in this awkward term of ARIA. So it stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. But they're usually of two types. They're usually swelling in the brain or microbleeds in the brain. And that sounds kind of scary. The good news is the ARIA side effects, when they do occur, usually don't actually result in actual symptoms, even though they might be viewed on an image. But they can result in, oftentimes it's like headaches or nausea or dizziness. In very rare cases, they might actually result in hospitalization. So that ARIA class of symptoms of the swelling and the bleeding in the brain are what are the most concerning side effects. But to be really detected, here's where another wrinkle of the complexity of this treatment, you probably need to be getting neuroimaging to really. So another recommendation would be not only should you come in for an infusion every 2 weeks for this treatment, but ideally you should also be followed with some neuroimaging to kind of track whether this is happening. So it's not like just taking a pill and we'll see it in 6 months.
And one question also following on your question. You mentioned that we're on a slow decline and these drugs just slow it. And we all kind of feel like we don't want to cure, right? But slowing the decline is worth something, right?
Yeah, I think for some families, maybe even if it's like 6 months of the person being able to still continue to drive, or the quality of life of that kind of slow decline might manifest itself in a lot of different ways that can be valuable for both the patient and their loved ones. So yeah, I don't think we want to dismiss the importance of, even if it is still ultimately a decline, of having it at a less steep trajectory. Yes, sir.
I don't understand the amyloid part of ARIA, the amyloid related in it. Does that mean that you have to have a PET scan that shows there's amyloid there?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of the drug, the whole rationale of the drug is that it's an anti-amyloid therapy. And part of the reason it was actually, kind of in the weeds here, it was approved under what's called the accelerated approval mechanism that the FDA uses as opposed to kind of a full approval that it usually does. And part of its rationale for that was because it was seen as, we know for sure it's clearing amyloid plaques from the brain. And that was seen as in and of itself an important outcome to help merit approval. So both of these drugs and many other drugs that have been tested, they're all built around this idea of clearing amyloid plaques from the brain. And that's why I think we're seeing such a focus on amyloid. Some people have said we focus too much on amyloid. If you follow this, you almost have like two camps. There's like the amyloid camp, and then there's the tau camp. And the tau people are like, tau is actually more tightly correlated with people's cognition. And so if you have to project into the future, I imagine what we'll ultimately see is like a combination therapy approach. We'll have some anti-amyloid therapies, we'll have some anti-tau tangle therapies, we're going to have some anti-inflammation, brain inflammation. So it might end up being kind of a cocktail approach. Because not only do we have amyloid imaging, we do now have tau imaging to detect tau tangles in the brain. So I know we're getting a very biological and complicated, hopefully not too wonky here. Other questions on these new drugs? And Stephanie Nava, my colleague from the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Center in the back, she's got some materials. I'm actually not the best person to talk to on these therapies. We have a brain neurologist, Judy Heidebrink, who's going to be giving a talk in a couple of weeks that's accessible online to the general public. So if you're interested in these issues, you should tune in to her in a couple of weeks. All right, let's keep moving along. So I mentioned the Alzheimer's Association before. They've got this segment of their website called the 10 Warning Signs of Alzheimer's. And maybe it goes back to the question that was mentioned earlier about when do you know something is like worth really checking out, or when it might just be part of normal aging. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but I think this chart kind of shows that there's certain signs and symptoms that we do see as characteristic of something like Alzheimer's versus something that might be kind of a typical age-related change. And so this first one here is kind of memory loss that disrupts daily life as compared to occasionally forgetting a name, but then you remember it later. Or if you're like me, you're like, where's my car in the parking lot? Or you get it quickly on a terrible sense of direction, so I'm easily like getting lost even though I'm traveling in Ann Arbor for years. But then I usually, I figure it out ultimately, versus I've gone to the same grocery store for 25 years straight, and I totally get lost, and I have no idea where I am. That would be kind of much more concerning, even though you could say all the way off place on the same continuum. And that kind of gets down to this familiar tasks versus taking a wrong turn. Orientation is a big thing, like for like me, like especially if you're on vacation, like what day is it today? But I know we're in the 2020s. I know. But the more advanced the memory, I think most of the people maybe lose track of even what year it is, or who's you see these questions out, like, who's the president? What building are you? Those kind of things. So again, I'm interested. I'm not going to march through all of these, but hopefully you can see from them, hopefully being able to make this distinction between something that's, kind of something that affects all of us, particularly as we age, versus some of these on the left here. Language is another thing. So you might forget a word every now and then, or forget a name every now and then, versus forgetting the name of your adult child. So any questions or comments on this distinction between what's normal age-related changes in cognition versus what might be a concerning warning sign for Alzheimer's?
I had one from the online group. This is more of a comment from a member. My husband lived with dementia for 16 years, 2004 to 2020. When we were in the early years, but over the next years, he had none of the presentational behaviors of that diagnosis. I realized then that doctors could give us very little clarity on what was happening to him. Even the brain imaging came back inconclusive. I mentioned this cannot answer questions or predict behaviors, or provide any certainty of diagnostic accuracy and offer predictive scenarios of the life to come.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. This tend to be really complicated stuff, and that's why I talked earlier about ideally the need for a specialist. And because sometimes we do have, Alzheimer's is just one type of dementia. It can get really complicated when you're talking about other types of dementia that are rare, that maybe have symptoms that overlap with other conditions. I'm thinking of Lewy body dementia, for example, where some of the symptoms are more kind of visual spatial in nature, or maybe psychotic symptoms even might occur. And so you're often trying to figure, is this a dementia, or is this a severe psychiatric illness? So I think that comment is very well taken, how even experts can sometimes be confused by what's happening, and you don't always have an accurate diagnosis right out of the gate. Yes, ma'am?
Lewy body, which I don't know what that is. Can you-
So Lewy body dementia, so again, it's another dementia, meaning again, it has this kind of slow decline in cognition over time, but it's not caused by the amyloid plaques and tangles that I've been talking about with Alzheimer's. It's caused by these Lewy bodies that develop in the brain that account for the difficulty, some of the symptoms I was just mentioning. So again, this is where very careful differential diagnosis would be important, or maybe imaging might be important, where again, an informative report, because again, sometimes the symptoms are going to look a little bit different than your classic Alzheimer's. But across all the dementias, there's going to be some commonality often too, and so that's where it is very tricky business to kind of make a definitive diagnosis across the different types of dementia. All right, so let's talk about risk factors. So before I get into that, I just want to get into research on risk and protective factors for Alzheimer's related dementias. Are informative, but I think it is challenging here too, because as Nancy well knows in public health, a lot of times the studies that we get our information from about risk and protective factors have some important limitations. Or sometimes the studies are about dementia writ large, but don't really distinguish like what type. Sometimes they're really studies that are just what we call cross-sectional, one snapshot in time, as opposed to following the same people over time. Sometimes the studies are of very biased groups. They tend to be of maybe very highly educated people or mostly white people. So there's a lot of ways in which any single study may have important limitations that we need to keep in mind before going to the bank or about its conclusions. So, and I like to show this example. You probably heard of that phrase of just correlation is not causation. Just because two things are linked doesn't mean one causes the other. This is, and that's why we really in public health talk about the importance of replication of findings. So, all kinds of different studies from all parts of the globe, they're all kind of pointing in the same direction for a conclusion. We give that a lot of credence as opposed to maybe just a stray study here and there that is coming up to that conclusion. But this is a chart. Looks like, wow, these two things are super correlated. They must have a lot to do with each other. Divorce rate in Maine correlated with per capita consumption of margarine. So, I don't know, maybe there is something about margarine and Meryl Streep, but you might have an idea?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
That is about, is there been much research done on people over 90 and any difference between that older group and the younger groups?
Yeah, there are some studies. I mentioned the centenarian study that's at Boston University. There's a study in the UC system of this 90-plus group. And so I think those studies have been primarily to maybe try to look at health and resilience. So basically trying to think about what characterizes these folks who've gotten to age 90s and 100s, what might help account for the fact that they're cognitively fine and they're physically active. And I think there have been, the conclusions from those studies have suggested, that as you might expect, some of it has to do with healthy lifestyle, health behaviors. There's also some suggestion that maybe genetics could play some role too. The principal investigator of the centenarian study in Boston that I mentioned, he was asked, what's the key to kind of successful long life into your hundreds? And his answer somewhat glibly was, pick your parents wisely. This idea of genetics, can be important. So I think it's, like many studies, it's, often it's not any one single thing, but it's this combination of factors. But we probably don't have enough studies of that oldest old group, the 85 and above, but there are a few examples that I just mentioned. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I was talking to my cousin yesterday, and she had read something about a study that said there was a relationship between Alzheimer's and long COVID. Have you heard anything about that?
Yes, the question is about the link between Alzheimer's and long COVID. I think it's too soon to really know for sure.
Yeah.
That being said, the Alzheimer's Association is a funder of some of these long COVID studies that are looking at the effects of long COVID on cognition. So I think it is an active area of research that might yield some interesting findings in the coming years. But I think, to me, it's just too early to really know of any kind of plausible link between those two.
So I saw that occurred before, and I started to wonder, is there a causality like stress or something like that? Because people getting divorced are more stressed, and thus they may also eat more margarine.
Yeah. I like that idea. For those online, the comment was, could both of these be explained by a third factor of stress? And so I think that's certainly a common phenomenon in research, is are you really measuring the kind of ultimate causes of the phenomenon you're trying to. So I think that's, actually, I know you're making somewhat in jest, but I think it's an important point because we're not always accounting for all possible underlying factors when we do research of this kind.
Here's another question from online.
Yes.
Are there other behaviors we should look for if someone engages in behaviors that would mask many of these signs? For example, always using GPS when driving, even on routine ones.
I would say certainly people are pretty good at masking things they're maybe embarrassed about or concerned about. So I think that's an important factor. But I also think we're in an age where we kind of do worry about this a lot. So people can go the other direction, like where they're over-interpreting the symptoms. So I am going to go through a lot of these risks and protective factors, so maybe that'll help clarify things. All right, so we talked about old age as a really important risk factor. So this is kind of the bad news slide, because these are all things we can't really do anything about. Female sex, so women are at slightly elevated risk for Alzheimer's compared to men. Some people have actually said we don't usually think of Alzheimer's as a women's health issue, but because women are at higher risk and they're disproportionately represented among caregivers and the associated mental and physical health burdens of caregiving, I think you can make the case that Alzheimer's is actually a women's health issue. I mentioned genetic variants, so let me talk a little bit more about those. So there are some rare genetic mutations where if you possess one of these, you'll pretty much inevitably develop Alzheimer's and way earlier than you usually see. If you've ever seen the movie Still Alice, this is kind of a depiction of it. Julianne Moore won an Oscar for playing a college professor in her 50s who had one of these rare mutations, and she ended up developing Alzheimer's. So we've actually known about this since the 90s, these different genes. There's 3 main genes that are identified here. Fortunately, they're pretty rare, so they account for a very small proportion of all Alzheimer's cases. But as I mentioned, the disease onset is decades earlier than usual. The course of the disease is also more rapid, so people's symptoms usually progress more quickly. So it's a terrible, terrible type of Alzheimer's to have. And interestingly, it also presents some dilemmas for adult children because these mutations are passed down from parent to child. And so if you have a parent with one of these mutations, you have a 50-50 chance of inheriting that. And in the film, I'm going to talk about the drama of the adult children want to learn their status or not. So we do have, actually, Wendy Allman, my colleague here, is a genetic counselor. She works with these patients and families. So this genetic testing is possible. But as I mentioned, it is pretty rare, and usually someone would know they're a candidate because they have a pretty loaded family history of Alzheimer's that might be occurring in the 40s and 50s. The genetic link to Alzheimer's that's perhaps more relevant to a broad population is known as the ApoE gene. So we all have an ApoE genotype. We each inherit one ApoAllele from each of our parents. And so there's the alleles are called E2, E3, and E4. And so it's the E4 allele that's the variant that is associated with Alzheimer's risk. And so you can see here almost 25% of the population are E4 carriers, maybe even more. So 23% are what we call this 3-4. 2% have two copies, so they've inherited an E4 allele from each parent. And this group's at even higher risk. But the fact that this risk allele is present in about 1 in 4 people in the general population makes it pretty noteworthy. And just to give you some of the numbers that were maybe requested earlier, in the general population, the lifetime chances of developing Alzheimer's are 10 to 15%. If you have one of these E4 alleles, your risk is doubled to about 20 to 30%. And if you have two copies, it might even be higher than 50%. So you can see why this E4 allele is a very important risk factor for the condition. On the other hand, having an E4 allele is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause Alzheimer's. So you could have an E4 allele, never get a disease. You could have a disease and be, the 3-3 genotype that's most common in the general population. So I know this is kind of complicated. I went through it pretty quickly, so let me pause to see if people have any questions about this link between ApoE genotype and risk of Alzheimer's.
I'm not sure if this is related to the alleles, but how strong a family history do you have to have for Alzheimer's before you have concern?
I mean, again, it kind of depends on your worry level at some level. I think having even just one first-degree affected relative probably roughly doubles your risk. So if you have a parent or sibling, your chances are probably again more than this kind of 20 to 30%. But for some people, they're like, well, that means 70, 80% chance I'm not going to get it. I'm actually not that worried. Versus others are like, if it's elevated, I really want to stay on top of things. So part of it to me has to do with kind of your tolerance for this kind of risk, so it's going to be a wishy-washy answer, but that's where I stand. I'll give a retort or not.
No, I'm just curious too. I mean, if somebody has one relative and they have a lot of different type of persons worries about them, I'm concerned if you have 2 or 3 generations of the disease, that might put you at a greater risk for having a problem.
I think to be referred to one of these specialty clinics, like for formal genetic testing, you probably would more than one first-degree relative, and or some relatives at onset, like age below 60. Those might kind of warrant a referral. But it's different with Alzheimer's. We talk about these risk issues with cancer screening all the time. Oh, if you have elevated cancer history in your family, maybe you get a colonoscopy 5 or 10 years earlier, or a mammography earlier. But again, with Alzheimer's, you don't have the same benefits in terms of proven treatment and prevention options. So it's not like a medical establishment saying you better get in and be seen, because we can't say, oh, here's the treatment or the preventive surgery we're going to offer. Question in the back.
What about an ant?
So an ant is, is notable, but it's not what we call a first-degree relative. So from a genetic standpoint, it wouldn't be as concerning. If you get like multiple ants that maybe are uncles. So yeah, there's no like magic threshold that kind of dictates, oh, you should or shouldn't do this. But I guess I'm just trying to talk about the importance of family history more broadly, and some of these. The family history might be linked to what genes you then inherit from your parents. Interestingly, ApoE testing is available direct to consumer. I'm not endorsing 23andMe, but back in 2017, the FDA did approve 23andMe to offer this kind of testing. And if you know anything about 23andMe, you know that they offer all kinds of genetic tests. They have BRCA testing is offered there, but then they also have genetics to link to your ancestry or to traits. So you just stick in the tube, you send it back, and then you get all kinds of information. People in the medical establishment get concerned because they feel like people can very easily misconstrue results because really you're just logging in and reading things online. You're not meeting with a professional to help explain things. But the FDA felt comfortable enough that they allowed 23andMe to offer ApoE testing along with several other tests in a direct-to-consumer format. Let's talk about lifestyle interventions. So going back to the Alzheimer's Association, they have this campaign called 10 Ways to Love Your Brain. And so a lot of these you probably have heard about. And a lot of these are things we should probably just be doing anyway. So I'm not going to march through all of them. I'm going to kind of emphasize some of them in subsequent slides. But it's the kind of things that we're told about for other conditions as well, whether it's kind of eating well, getting good sleep, don't smoke, exercise, be socially engaged, be cognitively active, these kinds of things that I think most of us would probably think of as important for general physical health and just important for a good quality of life overall. But let's go into some of the details of some of the research that kind of maybe explicitly made the case for certain behaviors. The WHO has some general guidelines on risk reduction, and they're talking about reduction of risk for dementia overall, not just Alzheimer's. So the strong recommendations they have are kind of increased physical activity, smoking cessation, management of hypertension, diabetes, and high cholesterol. And they actually have a specific recommendation against vitamin or supplement use, not against it completely, but just against it as specifically with the end goal of reducing risk of cognitive decline or dementia. They didn't feel like the data warranted vitamin or supplement use for that specific purpose. It may be important for other reasons to take vitamins or supplements, but they did not feel that that was strongly to reduce the risk of dementia. And they have more cautious but still moderate recommendations on things like cognitive training, this idea of, there might be certain programs you've heard out there, like this one called Luminosity, it's like, you kind of go online and use computer games to kind of keep sharp, reduce alcohol use, it is January, after all. Weight management. So again, you've probably heard about these things in the context of the risk of other health conditions, but here's the WHO saying these might also specifically be useful for lowering risk of dementia. The challenge is, as Nancy and I know in HGHE, a lot of folks don't follow these recommendations well, and almost half of our adult population is physically inactive. We've got high rates of obesity. Luckily, over time, smoking rates have come down. Hypertension is still very, very common. So these things are challenges for a lot of us. I wanted to underscore the vitamin and supplement point because I do think I've noticed some mild concern about kind of the marketing of different kinds of products that are maybe capitalizing on these fears of Alzheimer's and other dementia. So I think if you go to the health food store, you might see things like senior moments, brain health supplements, focus factor, nutrition for the brain. So these nutraceuticals are a relatively unregulated market. I don't think they're necessarily harmful, like physically, but I think they may take advantage to some extent on people's anxieties, and some of these, again, don't have high utility associated with them. So I don't know if they're going to do that. Yes, sir.
One just quick concern about the vitamins. The 1 a day brand multivitamin has made tons of money on that advertising campaign. Does the FDA actually think, or whoever made up the rules about vitamins, that it could be harmful to you to take one multivitamin a day?
Well, I guess there are some rare cases that you take certain vitamins in super high doses, there could be some physical, I think those are relatively rare. I guess the harms I'm suggesting here are not so much like toxicity from hyperuse of vitamins, it's more just like, are you really, you might be just wasting your money by taking products that really aren't living up to the billing. You often see these, because there are some rules about it, they can't say anything on these nutraceuticals about specific conditions. So you will often see these more vague statements like nutrition for the brain or supports memory. It's kind of softly worded, talking about kind of general skills as opposed to this treats disease X or reduces risk Y.
And the predators would be in that category?
Actually, I don't know what to do.
Predator? Yeah. It's advertised on TV.
Okay. I'm watching football and saying all the Viagra commercials. So I think exercise, I think, is really important to point out. It has so many benefits, and potentially lowering risk of dementia is one of them. But I'm sure this group knows about its importance in kind of lowering risk of everything from heart disease to cancer, improve mood. Of course, it's easier said than done, but I think we do have a pretty good body of evidence to suggest that particularly moderate to vigorous physical activity is useful. In case you're curious about what the federal guidelines are, the goal is 150 minutes a week of aerobic activity. But before people run out and do that, I think you might want to check with your healthcare provider. Don't go from 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds. But I think the general rule of thumb might be do more than you're doing now if you are generally sedentary. I think, again, these things you should have heard before. There's also a slogan out there that's making the rounds: what's good for the heart is good for the brain. In recognition that, again, a lot of the things that are risk factors for heart disease that we've talked about for years also seem to be risk factors for dementia. In fact, there have been some clinical trials. There was a big clinical trial called the Sprint Mind study that showed that aggressive management of hypertension did seem to have some benefits in terms of delaying onset of any kind of cognitive decline. So I do think we're seeing some hope that kind of treating heart disease risk factors is also having some benefit in terms of lowering chances of dementia. Eating well is, of course, important. There's been some interesting data from studies that look specifically at the Mediterranean diet, that some of you may know about, that kind of emphasizes increased intake of fruits and vegetables, staying away from high fat, high sugar, highly processed foods. So, thinking about what can you substitute, what can you swap in if you're like me, you much prefer this stuff over here. But thinking about maybe there are ways to swap in some of these more nutrient-dense snacks. I think there was a New York Times article on this very topic just this past week, kind of making this case for trying to make some of these substitutions in your diet. I'm from Philadelphia, they landed a cheesesteak, so that's a change. The Lancet, which is a group that talks about public health issues, medicine issues a lot, they put out an interesting recent report where, again, some of these similar recommendations are in, but they kind of group them into different categories. You can see they feel like some of these are really
might directly target some of the brain issues I've talked about. So they're talking about some of these behaviors might be directly linked to lowering your chances of having amyloid or tau in the brain. Whereas others might not directly affect those, but they might do what's called increase your cognitive reserve. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this term of cognitive reserve. It refers to this idea of if you have enhanced cognitive reserve, you're maybe better able to compensate if you do have some of those things going on in your brain, like amyloid and tau. It's not that you're getting rid of those, but your brain is perhaps better to still function okay even in the presence of those neuropathologies. And one of those things they point to in this Lancet report is actually hearing loss. They're not saying that addressing hearing loss is going to directly affect amyloid levels or tau levels, but they're thinking that it might help increase your cognitive reserve. And so I think it's important there's been one study looked at almost 800 people in their 50s. They followed them and they found that 4 years later, those who had hearing loss at the baseline visit were over 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with cognitive impairment. And I think it's really not that hard to think about why might this be the case, because hearing loss can also be linked to things like being socially and intellectually engaged. And to me, it was kind of sad to see these kinds of statistics where we have over 37 million in the U.S. who have some kind of hearing loss. The vast majority could benefit from some kind of hearing aid, but we only have 30% of age 70 plus who need one who ever used one. And I think there's a combination of things going on here where some of it may be access issues, but some of it may be like some of my relatives who are just very stubborn about the need for one, or they find it kind of frustrating, or they're embarrassed or whatever. So I think we have a really unmet need, though, and I think it can have so many benefits, perhaps lower risk of cognitive impairment to be one we don't think about that often when we talk about hearing aids and hearing loss. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about hearing loss because with young people today, and you can go out in the street and hear cars, kids going to rock concerts and all those different kinds of things. I just thought it'd be a really good idea to invest in hearing companies because I see younger people and more are going to be getting hearing loss from all of this.
Yeah.
And is that not going to impact this whole issue of cognitive?
Yeah, so the comment that goes online is about worrying about younger generations being at higher risk for hearing loss because of all the different ways in which you're being exposed to loud noises in different ways, whether it's listening to headphones or being around having rock music. Or one of my colleagues in public health, Rick Neitzel, he has a whole research program on noise pollution and all the interesting negative health effects of being around noise pollution. You might not think about. So yeah, something to contemplate. I mentioned cognitive training. I think this, again, refers to this idea of kind of practicing your cognitive skills. So some programs are very formal here. They maybe run you through like exercises, through maybe it's like an online computer game. If you're like me, your cognitive training is doing the New York Times Sunday crossword every Sunday. So there's a lot of different ways people can try to do cognitive activities to keep sharp. I think the studies that have looked at these more formal interventions have found some benefit of them. On the other hand, the interventions are pretty intense. They're usually multiple sessions a week, and they found that there's a little bit of a use it or lose it phenomenon where if people don't stay with it, then they may revert to baseline over time. But I still think this idea of kind of staying cognitively engaged is important. I think higher education itself is associated with lower risk of dementia. And I think, I imagine this group seems like a group that does pretty well with social and cognitive engagement and coming out on a weeknight to talks like this. And so, as you might imagine, some of the studies that have looked at these issues aren't just maybe relying on one approach. So there was an interesting line of research that was started in Finland, known as the Finger study. And so they did a longitudinal intervention trial. They really combined a lot of different approaches. They had nutritional guidance, physical exercise training, they had some cognitive training, they monitored for vascular risk factors, monitoring speed and executive functioning, which refers to this idea of being able to multitask, do many things at once. So there's been a lot of excitement. And again, these findings were, to be honest, more impressive than any of the drug trials that we were seeing at the time. And so there's a follow-up kind of study in the U.S. called the Pointer Study now, that's taking a similar approach and kind of combining these. So this recruitment is underway at these 6 sites. Sadly for us, Chicago is probably the closest, but we'll see. So I think I want to make the point that, again, it's not, even I talked earlier about new medications, that's certainly not the only way to think about affecting both reducing your risk, but also, even people who have cognitive impairment can benefit from some of these kinds of approaches. And because this is research, I want to, at the end here, put a little bit of plug in for our Alzheimer's Center. So Stephanie and the back and I are happy to be part of this group. We're one of, I think, 37 now such centers around the United States funded by NIH. And so we have a multi-part mission. We've got community education events like this. We've got wellness programs for caregivers. We do have a cognitive disorders clinic based in neurology. So we have some of the clinical care and education. But our real main mission is supporting research. And so we have over 25 studies right now, a whole range. And so after we wrap up, Stephanie's got a lot of materials that she's brought with her. So if you or somebody you know is interested in learning more, then we've got a variety of handouts. We've got some contact information. If you're willing to sign up, we have kind of a registry that's very easy to sign up for. There's no commitment, but it just would kind of allow you to learn about some of the different studies that are recruiting to see if you might be interested in taking part. And I mentioned earlier, Judy Heidebrink is a neurologist who is going to be speaking on the 24th. So she's going to be talking specifically about the latest in clinical trials for Alzheimer's. We'll be talking about Aduhelm and lecanemab, those 2 drugs. So fortunately, we're at the end of the talk, so the fact that we don't have a screen is not a big deal. But anyway, I covered a lot of ground. We have been able to do some questions along the way. But any other kind of questions before we wrap up? Yes,
Another question from online. Are there any caregivers research centers in the United States?
So yes and no. I mean, I'm not aware of research centers that all they do is caregiving research, but there's certainly a lot of great caregiving research embedded in Alzheimer's centers or other centers, and Michigan is no exception. We've got great colleagues in the School of Nursing who are doing caregiver research. We've got, I mentioned some of our wellness programs. We actually have a study in our center where one of our social workers is an expert in mindfulness-based stress reduction. So they're looking at an intervention to train caregivers in use of mindfulness to maybe help deal with the caregiving stress. Helen Kales, who used to be at Michigan, she's now in the UC system. She had a fantastic caregiver intervention study training caregivers to deal with behavioral and psychiatric symptoms. So there's really a lot of excellent caregiver research out there in different departments and different studies all across the U.S. And caregiver research is certainly a prominent theme within the Alzheimer's disease network that I spoke of. So I think we just, that network doesn't call itself caregiver research, it's the Alzheimer's Research Center. So I think most often caregiving research is part of the picture of a broader set of Alzheimer's research. Other questions? Yes.
What are you most excited about in terms of research going forward?
What am I most excited about in terms of just the field in general? Yeah, I think to me it's really exciting to think about the fact that we can now detect some of these biomarkers with a simple blood test. To me, gets me excited about really opening up kind of access to a much broader population of people and being able to kind of detect things earlier where we can intervene from a variety of perspectives, whether it's medical follow-up, whether it's recommendations for health and lifestyle. lifestyle, whether it's like advanced planning we didn't talk a lot about, a lot of families, it's really about kind of thinking strategically about, where they want to live, what family they want to be near, what kind of house do they want to have. So from an advanced planning standpoint, these kind of earlier identification of risk can, I think, be important. So I think the fact that we're able to do this in a variety of ways, and we're starting to see these biomarkers moving from these super advanced tests to a blood test, that to me gets me excited about some of the prospects of the change. Yes, ma'am.
You just mentioned psychiatric symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And how often do you see psychiatric symptoms with dementia? Hallucinations, paranoia, severe anxiety?
Yeah, they certainly can be present. They're not, I wouldn't say they're typically present in all cases. It depends on the type of dementia too. I mentioned Lewy body dementia earlier. That's a subtype where we see more prominent examples of the hallucinations you were talking about. But even in Alzheimer's, you can see things like, psychosis, like severe paranoia. You can see depression symptoms in terms of like being really apathetic or withdrawn. So they certainly are a relatively common feature. I think the challenge for me is something like, we have great colleagues in geriatric psychiatry. They worry about the over-medication of psychiatric symptoms as a context of dementia, as opposed to thinking about why is this symptom occurring, try to understand it, as opposed to immediately reaching for medication to treat it. So I guess it's a long way to say that they are certainly relatively common, but they can be treated and not just treated by medications, but can be treated by different kinds of caregiver strategies or changing the environment, that kind of thing. Yes? Yes.
Just your thoughts about the funding, the NIH funding for Alzheimer's dementia. Is it an upswing?
Yeah. Questions on the federal funding for Alzheimer's research. So it's been very much on the upswing for the past decade. It's one of the few things we find bipartisan support for these days. And there is actually congressionally earmarked funding specifically for Alzheimer's disease. So that's where I mentioned this network of centers. We've seen fairly dramatic growth in the number of Alzheimer's centers that have been funded by NIH. It's probably, Nancy as a former researcher knows, and NIH talking about these funding lines, like what percentile does your grant score get funded, so that it's easier to get funding through NIA than a lot of other institutes because of that increased congressionally mandated funding. So I think we're seeing lawmakers are recognizing, like looking at some of those statistics I showed you earlier about the dramatic increase. So I think we're seeing both increased funding in NIH, but then we're also in industry, we've seen a lot of investment in these drug trials as well. Of course, there's still a lot of work to be done where I think we don't see as much funding as really support for caregivers and families. We don't see, nursing home is usually, those costs are usually covered by Medicaid, not Medicare. We're also seeing, there's a lot of staff shortage, a lot of kind of frontline workers who work with dementia patients are poorly paid, kind of respite care options are, so I think there are, in terms of funding, I'd like to see more plowed into those kinds of services in addition to the research challenge.
And one more quick thought. The blood test you talked about, is it reasonable to think that in 5 years that it might be generally available, or is that too soon to think that?
Yeah, it's a question, like when was this blood test? So there is a blood test that's commercially available right now, actually. Again, like the imaging we were talking about, it's only recommended for differential diagnosis of someone with cognitive impairment, so it's not being marketed like, oh, you're worried about your memory, let's give you a blood test. So it is already here, actually, but it's not really in widespread use. But I do think we'll see it expand, particularly if additional treatments beyond lecanemab start to get approved. I think we'll see primary care docs starting, for example, to think about using that as maybe an initial screening test. Hey, does this person need to be, more additional assessment, or should I refer them on to neurology? I think we'll see the blood test used in that. That's the end of the.
So, we now have drugs to address the amyloid plaques. Sounds like there's stuff coming along for the tau tangles. But do we know absolutely that the amyloid plaques or the tau tangles cause Alzheimer's, or are they kind of appearing along with the symptoms? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, I think some have, the question is like, is amyloid the true culprit here, or tau, or both? I mean, by definition, amyloid and tau have to be present for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. That being said, a lot has been invested in just focusing on amyloid, as it was thought as like the kicks off this cascade. And we really don't have a lot to show for all the investment. And so some have suggested that we overinvested in anti-amyloid therapies. And because tau tangles, when you look at like what is more correlated with the actual symptoms, like when you have more of it, what gets worse, it's really the tau tangles that are more tightly correlated with people's cognition than amyloid plaques. So I think the jury is somewhat out on this. You can really, a lot of controversy, people have very strong opinions here. That's why, as I was saying earlier, I think ultimately what we'll probably see is an approach that tries to not just decide this or that, but tries to take a combination approach that addresses not only amyloid and tau, but then some of these other phenomena that start to happen in the brain too, whether it's inflammation or atrophy. So I think we probably will see kind of a combination of approaches over time. But I would ask Jeannie Hybrid, I'm a psychologist by training, she's a neurologist, probably have ultimately more expert take than I do. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, the relationship between hearing loss and Alzheimer's. Is the thought that it's because they're not able to participate fully in conversations, they just kind of turn off? Or is there actual physical damage more to consider?
I think it's more, so the question is, what's the pathway from hearing loss to Alzheimer's? I think the thought is that it's really not so much that hearing loss causes specific neuropathology. It's more that hearing loss impairs one's ability to cope well if that exists. Partially for the reasons you're talking about, that people maybe become less, they become withdrawn, less engaged. So this kind of use it or lose it phenomenon is more present in someone who has hearing loss because they're not as able to fully participate in their social and cognitive activities as they have in So I don't think it's the thought that all hearing loss is really damaging specific, creating certain lesions in the brain. I think we're almost about time.
I was just wondering if there was any evidence to indicate that we could catch it early enough with the preventive measures that we could actually reverse cognitive decline.
I think, so the question is about reversing cognitive decline. I think it's really difficult once cognitive decline starts to occur to really truly reverse it. So I think that's where the focus in a lot of the risk reduction behaviors has been trying to initiate these before cognitive decline even occurs. But that being said, I think some of these recommendations that I've provided can allow people maybe to function at a higher level for longer periods, even if they are experiencing cognitive impairment. And some of them too also, I don't want to make it all about cognition, some of these, like I said, have other benefits for other areas of physical health, and then also perhaps for quality of life or mood. So there's really kind of multiple ways in which some of these behaviors I've suggested can pay off. All right, well, I'm happy to stick around after if people have any kind of individual questions. Like I said, I hope you'll check in with Stephanie to learn more about our center and some of the programs we offer. But thanks so much for being a great day.
Yeah, let's-